On a rain-soaked Chicago night, Dominic Salvatore, the most feared Mafia boss in Illinois, encountered a homeless man who asked for $1. What happened next wasn't a bullet or a beating. It was something no one saw coming. The man's words unlocked a buried memory, and Dominic's decision in that moment set off a chain of events that would dismantle his empire, challenge his ruthlessness, and reveal the broken boy he'd spent 30 years burying beneath blood and power. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. Dominic Salvatore owned the night in Chicago. From the penthouse suite on Wacker Drive, he watched the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom of steel and broken promises. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, distorting the lights below into watercolor smears of gold and red. He stood with his back to the room, shoulders squared in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in 6 months. His reflection in the glass showed a man in his late 40s, dark hair graying at the temples, a jawline carved from discipline and violence. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Empty, cold, like 2 locked vaults guarding secrets too dangerous to name. Behind him, the penthouse hummed with controlled chaos. Marcus, his right hand for 15 years, reviewed territory reports at the marble dining table. Elena, Dominic's 26-year-old daughter, sat curled on the leather sofa, her delicate features illuminated by her phone screen. She wore a cream sweater that softened her beauty, but there was steel in her gaze when she looked at her father, a steel born from watching him prioritize power over everything else, including her. Northside collections are up 12%, Marcus reported, his voice flat and efficient. He was a man built like a linebacker, with hands that had broken bones and brokered deals in equal measure. The Taylor Street crew is quiet, too quiet. Dominic turned from the window, the city lights casting shadows across his face. Then make noise. Remind them who holds the leash. Dad, Elena's voice cut through the room like a knife through silk. I got into Northwestern's social work program. The words hung in the air. Marcus looked up from his papers. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that might have been pride or fear or both. Social work, he repeated, tasting the words like bitter medicine. Yes, I want to help people who... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Who fall through the cracks. The forgotten ones. Dominic walked to the bar and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, his movements deliberate. Outside, thunder rumbled low and threatening. You want to help the forgotten, he said quietly. In this city, the forgotten are forgotten for a reason, Elena. They're weak. They made choices. Or choices were made for them, she countered, standing now, her petite frame radiating defiance. Not everyone has a penthouse to hide in. The air between them crackled. Marcus wisely stayed silent, his eyes on his paperwork. Dominic took a slow drink, the amber liquid burning a familiar path down his throat. This was their dance, her idealism crashing against his iron pragmatism. She was his only child, the last piece of his late wife Maria, who died giving birth to her. The guilt of that loss had calcified into distance, a wall he'd built brick by brick until Elena had grown up more motherless and fatherless than any child should. You'll do what you want, Dominic finally said, his voice devoid of emotion. You always do. Elena grabbed her coat, a red peacoat that stood out like a wound against the room's muted grays and blacks. I'm going to the shelter on Adams Street. Some of us don't spend Friday nights counting blood money. She was gone before he could respond, the door closing with a controlled click that hurt more than a slam. The silence that followed was thick and accusatory. Marcus cleared his throat. She's got Maria's fire, he said carefully. She's got Maria's heart, Dominic corrected, finishing his bourbon. That's what worries me. Hearts get broken in this city, or worse, they get you killed. An hour later, Dominic sat in the back of his black Escalade, being driven through Chicago's South Loop by Tommy, his driver of 10 years. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon. They were heading to a meeting with the Carboni family, a delicate negotiation over territory near Little Italy that required Dominic's personal touch. Violence was profitable, but peace was cheaper. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, watching too many good soldiers die over blocks that looked the same as any other blocks. As they idled at a red light on State Street, Dominic's attention snagged on a figure huddled in a doorway. An old man, rail-thin, wrapped in a soaked cardboard fortress that was losing its battle against the weather. His face was mostly hidden, but his hand extended toward passing pedestrians, most of whom hurried past without acknowledgement, their umbrellas tilted against the rain, and their eyes fixed on destinations that didn't include him. "Stop the car," Dominic said. Tommy's eyes found his in the rearview mirror. "Boss?" "Stop. The car." The Escalade pulled to the curb. Dominic stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, ignoring Tommy's protest. Water immediately soaked through his expensive suit as he approached the homeless man. Up close, the man looked ancient, his skin like weathered leather, his eyes cloudy with cataracts. But when he looked up at Dominic, there was recognition there, not of who Dominic was, but of what he was. The old man had seen men in expensive suits before. He knew they rarely stopped to help. "Got $1, mister?" the man croaked, his voice ruined by decades of cold nights and cheap alcohol. Dominic stared at him. $1. The request was so small it was almost insulting. He spent more on a single cigar, but something about this moment, the rain, the empty street, the old man's resignation, triggered a memory so sharp it felt like a blade between his ribs. He was 7 years old, standing in the rain on this exact street with his mother, Rosa. She was crying, begging strangers for money while little Dominic clung to her worn coat. His father had died 2 months earlier, crushed in a factory accident that the company called unavoidable and refused to compensate. They'd been evicted from their apartment. His mother was desperate, broken, asking for dollars to buy her son food, and everyone, every single person, had walked past them like they were ghosts. Dominic pulled out his wallet. The old man's eyes tracked the movement with practiced wariness, ready for violence or mockery, but Dominic didn't pull out $1. He pulled out $500 bills and pressed them into the man's skeletal hand. The man stared at the money like it might disappear. This ain't real. Why?" Dominic knelt down, his expensive suit soaking up filthy water from the sidewalk. His face was inches from the old man's. "What's your name?" "Frank. Frank Delaney." "Frank, you ever have a family?" The man's eyes misted. "Had a daughter once. Lost her to the streets. System took her when I couldn't stay clean. She'd be about 26 now, if she's still alive." 26. Elena's age. The universe had a sick sense of humor. Dominic stood, rain streaming down his face. "There's a shelter on Adams Street. Good people there. Tell them Dominic sent you. They'll take care of you." He walked back to the Escalade, leaving Frank staring after him in confusion and disbelief. Tommy said nothing as they pulled back into traffic, but his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, studying his boss like he was seeing a stranger. Dominic ignored him, his thoughts churning. That memory of his mother. He'd buried it deep, weaponized the pain into something useful. Humiliation had forged him into someone who would never beg, never be weak, never be forgotten. But as the Escalade cut through the rain-soaked city toward his meeting, Dominic couldn't shake the image of Frank's face, or the ghost of his mother's tears, or the way Elena had looked at him before she left. Disappointed, disgusted, distant. For the first time in 30 years, the king of Chicago's underworld felt something crack in the armor he'd spent decades building. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, spreading like a fracture in ice, waiting for the right pressure to shatter everything. The rain continued to fall, indifferent and eternal, as Dominic Salvatore drove deeper into the night and the life he'd chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen him. Behind them, Frank Delaney clutched $500 and wept, not understanding that he'd just planted a seed in the most unlikely soil, a seed that would grow into something neither man could possibly imagine, something that would shake the foundations of power and force a reckoning with ghosts long buried. The night swallowed them both, predator and prey, king and beggar, each carrying wounds that rain alone could never wash clean. The Carboni meeting went exactly as expected. Dominic sat across from Vincent Carboni in a private room at Rossi's, an Italian restaurant in Little Italy that had served as neutral ground for Chicago's underworld since the 1950s. The walls were decorated with fading photographs of old-world Sicily and stained with decades of cigar smoke. Vincent was younger than Dominic by 10 years, hungry and ambitious, but smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched. They negotiated territory lines over osso buco and red wine, their words coded in metaphors about business opportunities and mutual respect. By dessert, they'd reached an agreement that would keep the peace for at least 6 months, maybe longer if both sides controlled their younger soldiers' appetites for glory. But Dominic's mind kept drifting back to Frank Delaney in that doorway, to his mother's tears on State Street 30 years ago, to Elena's disappointed eyes. Marcus noticed. "You're distracted tonight, boss. Something wrong?" Dominic cut into his tiramisu with mechanical precision. "Everything's fine. Deal's done." "The deal, yeah. But you're somewhere else. I've known you too long to miss it." Dominic set down his fork and met Marcus's gaze. In the dim restaurant lighting, his right-hand man looked older, worn down by years of violence and moral compromise. They'd grown up together in Bridgeport, two boys from nothing who'd clawed their way to something. Marcus had been there when Dominic's mother died from pneumonia in a county hospital that treated her like garbage. He'd been there for Dominic's first collection, first enforcement, first kill. They'd built this empire together, brick by bloody brick. "Saw a homeless guy tonight," Dominic said finally. "Reminded me of how things used to be. Before all this." Marcus leaned back, studying him. "That's dangerous territory, Dom. Remembering, we left those people behind for a reason. Did we leave them, or did we become exactly what we hated?" The question hung between them like a live grenade. Marcus's jaw tightened. "We became survivors. We made choices that kept us alive, kept us powerful. You start second-guessing now after everything. That's how you lose. That's how you die." Dominic knew Marcus was right. In their world, hesitation was fatal. Weakness was blood in the water. But that crack in his armor was spreading, letting in light and doubt and memory. He signaled for the check, eager to end this night, and silence the voices in his head. By the time he returned to the penthouse, it was past midnight. He expected darkness and silence, but lights blazed from the living room. Elena sat on the sofa, still wearing her red coat, her face flushed with emotion and purpose. "You're up late," Dominic observed, shrugging off his wet jacket. "I met someone tonight," Elena said, her voice trembling with controlled excitement. "At the shelter. An old man named Frank Delaney. He told me the most incredible story. Said a man in an expensive suit gave him $500 in the rain, told him to go to Adams Street." Dominic's blood went cold. He'd told Frank his name, but surely the old man hadn't. "He described you, Dad. The suit, the car, the way you looked at him. It was you, wasn't it?" Silence. Then slowly, Dominic poured himself another bourbon at the bar. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. Maybe? Elena stood, crossing to him. She was so small compared to him, barely reaching his shoulder. But in that moment she seemed enormous. "Dad, do you understand what that money means to him? He's been on the streets for 8 years. That money, it's hope. It's possibility. Why did you do it?" Dominic stared into his glass. "I don't know." "Yes, you do. Tell me." The words came before he could stop them. "He reminded me of my mother. Of us. When I was a kid, we were one step from where he is. Nobody helped us. Everyone walked past like we were invisible. I guess I wanted to be different than they were. For once." Elena's eyes filled with tears. She did something then that she hadn't done in years. She hugged him. Her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his chest. Dominic stood frozen, his arms at his sides, unsure how to respond to this sudden intimacy. Slowly, carefully, like handling something precious and fragile, he lifted his arms and held her. "There's still good in you," Elena whispered. "I knew it. I always knew it." But Dominic wasn't so sure. One act of kindness didn't erase 30 years of blood. It didn't bring back the people he'd hurt, the families he'd destroyed, the empire built on fear and pain. Still, holding his daughter, feeling her believe in him, something shifted. The crack widened. Over the next 2 weeks, something strange happened. Elena began volunteering at the Adams Street shelter regularly, and she insisted Dominic visit with her. He resisted at first, using work as an excuse, but her persistence wore him down. Finally, on a gray Saturday afternoon, he found himself walking through the shelter's doors beside his daughter. The place smelled like industrial cleaner and cooked vegetables. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow that tried too hard to mask the underlying desperation. Dozens of people filled the space, men and women of all ages, carrying their lives in backpacks and garbage bags, their eyes holding stories of loss and survival. Dominic felt exposed, uncomfortable, like an imposter in a world he'd spent decades avoiding. "Mr. Salvatore," Frank Delaney shuffled toward them, transformed from the rain-soaked wraith Dominic had met on State Street. He'd gained weight, his clothes were clean, and his eyes were clearer. "I've been looking for you. Wanted to thank you proper. That money, it changed everything. I got into a recovery program, got my ID reissued. I'm even talking to a caseworker about finding my daughter." Dominic shook the old man's hand, acutely aware of Elena watching this interaction with hope radiating from her. "Glad you're doing better, Frank." "Better? I'm alive again, son. First time in years I feel like maybe there's a point to waking up." Frank's eyes misted. "Why'd you help me? You don't seem like the type." "I'm not," Dominic admitted. "But maybe that's the problem." Elena introduced him to others at the shelter. A young mother named Sandra with 2 kids, fleeing an abusive marriage. A veteran named Carlos, who'd returned from Afghanistan with PTSD and lost everything to the nightmares. A teenager named Deshawn, who'd aged out of foster care at 18 with nowhere to go. Each person was a story, a tragedy, a life that had fallen through society's cracks exactly as Elena had said, and each person looked at Dominic with a mixture of suspicion and hope, sensing something dangerous about him, but desperate enough not to care. By the time they left, dusk was settling over Chicago. Elena was animated, talking about programs and funding and how they could help more people. Dominic listened, watching his daughter's passion, feeling the weight of his double life pressing down like a physical thing. She thought one act of kindness made him good. She didn't know about the things he'd done just this week, the enforcement collection that had sent a man to the hospital, the threat delivered to a city councilman who'd forgotten whose pocket he was in, the shipment of black market goods that had moved through his territory. "Dad," Elena said as they walked to his car, "thank you for coming today. I know it's not your world. It used to be," he said quietly. That night, alone in his penthouse, Dominic stood at the same window where this had all started. The rain had returned, steady and insistent, drumming against the glass like fingers asking to be let in. He thought about Frank's question. "Why'd you help me?" The truth was complicated, messy, rooted in trauma and memory, and a lifetime of running from the boy he'd been. But maybe Elena was right. Maybe there was still good in him, buried deep beneath the violence and power. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking. Maybe he was exactly what Marcus said, a survivor who'd made choices to stay alive. The rain continued to fall, washing the city but never quite making it clean, and Dominic Salvatore stood at the crossroads of 2 lives, unable to fully commit to either, sensing that the choice he'd avoided for 30 years was finally coming due. The foundation he'd built was cracking, and he couldn't tell if that meant collapse or transformation. All he knew was that something had started the night he'd stopped for Frank Delaney, and momentum was building toward something he couldn't yet see, but could feel approaching, like thunder on the horizon. The problem started on a Tuesday. Dominic was in his office at the legitimate front company, Salvatore Imports, a shipping business that moved legal goods and concealed illegal operations in equal measure, when Marcus burst in without knocking. His face was stone, but his eyes burned with barely controlled anger. "We got a situation," Marcus said, closing the door. "Tony Ricci is making moves." Tony Ricci. The name alone made Dominic's jaw tighten. Ricci ran operations on the West Side, a rising power with ambitions that exceeded his territory. He was young, late 30s, with a reputation for brutality that made even hardened criminals nervous. More importantly, he'd been testing boundaries for months, pushing against the established order that kept Chicago's underworld from descending into all-out war. "What kind of moves?" Dominic asked, his voice deadly calm. "He hit one of our collection spots on Roosevelt Road. Walked in with 6 guys, roughed up Tommy Greco, took 40 grand, left a message." Marcus slid a photo across the desk. The image showed Tommy's bruised face and a message written in marker on his forehead. "Salvatore's getting soft." Dominic studied the photo, his mind calculating angles and responses. In their world, this wasn't just theft, it was a direct challenge to his authority. If he didn't respond with overwhelming force, others would see weakness and attack. His empire was held together by reputation and fear. One crack could bring the whole structure down. "Where's Ricci now?" Dominic asked. "His club on Pulaski. Probably celebrating, the stupid bastard." Dominic should have felt rage. 6 months ago, he would have. He would have gathered his soldiers and painted Pulaski Avenue red with Ricci's blood. But now, with Elena's face in his mind and Frank Delaney's gratitude echoing in his ears, he felt something different. Exhaustion. He was tired of the violence, tired of the endless cycle of revenge and counter-revenge that had defined 30 years of his life. "Set up a meeting," Dominic said. Marcus stared at him. A meeting? Dom, this prick just stole from us and disrespected you publicly. You meet with him, you look weak. You look weak. We're done. I said set up a meeting, Dominic repeated, his voice harder now. Neutral ground. I want to hear what he wants before we start a war. Marcus's expression said everything his mouth didn't. This is a mistake. This is how you die. But he was loyal to his bones, so he nodded. I'll make the call, but I'm bringing every soldier we have. This smells like a setup. The meeting was scheduled for Friday night at an old warehouse in Pilsen, a neighborhood that straddled multiple territories and therefore belonged to no one. Dominic arrived with Marcus and 8 armed men, enough to defend themselves, but not enough to start a war. The warehouse was abandoned, filled with rusting equipment and shadows that moved when the wind pushed through broken windows. Rain drummed on the metal roof, creating a constant percussion that set everyone's nerves on edge. Tony Ricci arrived exactly on time with his own crew. He was shorter than Dominic expected, maybe 5'8", but built like a middleweight boxer. His suit was expensive but flashy, purple silk that screamed new money and insecurity. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. Dominic Salvatore, Ricci said, spreading his arms like they were old friends. The king himself. I'm honored. Cut the bullshit, Tony. You hit my spot, took my money, disrespected my people. So I'm here to ask you directly. What do you want? Ricci's smile faded. He circled Dominic slowly, his movements predatory. What I want what you got. Power, territory, respect. You've had your run, old man. 30 years at the top. But times change. Chicago's changing. And you... He stopped, inches from Dominic's face. You're getting soft. Word on the street is you're playing Santa Claus with homeless people, hanging around shelters, going domestic with your daughter. The warehouse went silent, except for the rain. Dominic's soldiers tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons. But Dominic remained still, his eyes locked on Ricci's. So that was it. Someone had been watching him, tracking his movements, weaponizing his one act of kindness into evidence of weakness. Who told you that? Dominic asked quietly. Does it matter? Point is, it's true. The mighty Dominic Salvatore is growing a conscience. That's dangerous in our business. Makes people think you're vulnerable. Makes people like me think maybe it's time for new leadership. Marcus stepped forward, his voice a growl. You arrogant little... Dominic raised a hand, stopping him. So this is a coup attempt. You think because I helped one homeless man, I've gone soft. You think you can take what I built. Not think, Dominic. No. Ricci pulled out a cigarette, lit it, blew smoke in Dominic's direction. I'm giving you a choice, which is more than most would. Step down, retire, take your daughter and disappear. I'll even let you keep some territory for income, out of respect for what you were. Or refuse, and we go to war. And wars are messy. People get hurt. Daughters included. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Dominic's hands clenched into fists, every instinct screaming for violence. But Elena's face flashed in his mind. The shelter, Frank, the people he'd met who'd lost everything to violence and bad choices. If he started a war with Ricci, innocent people would die. His own people would die. And Elena, God, if anything happened to Elena because of his life, I'll think about it, Dominic said, his voice betraying nothing. Ricci looked surprised. You'll think about it? That's not the Dominic Salvatore I heard about. Maybe you heard wrong. You'll have my answer in 48 hours. They left the warehouse, tension crackling like electricity. In the car, Marcus exploded. You'll think about it? Dom, what the hell was that? We looked weak. We should have ended him right there. In a warehouse surrounded by his soldiers? That's how you start a bloodbath, not how you win. Dominic stared out at the rain-soaked streets. We need to be smart about this. Smart? Smart is showing strength. That punk threatened Elena. Threatened you. And you just walked away. I walked away because killing him tonight would have started a war we're not ready for. Ricci's not alone. He's got backing, resources, soldiers willing to die for him. If we move against him, it has to be decisive, complete. No survivors to regroup and retaliate. Marcus processed this, his anger cooling into calculation. You're planning something. I'm always planning something. But the truth was more complicated. Dominic was planning, yes, but he was also questioning. For the first time in 30 years, he wondered if the life he'd built was worth defending. Marcus was right. They could mobilize their forces, crush Ricci, maintain power. But then what? Another decade of violence? Another challenger rising up? An endless cycle until someone finally got lucky and put a bullet in his brain, or worse, in Elena's? That night, Dominic did something he hadn't done in years. He called his daughter and asked her to dinner. They met at a quiet restaurant in Lincoln Park, far from his usual haunts. Elena wore a blue dress that made her look younger, more vulnerable. She was cautious at first, expecting another lecture about her career choices or her naive worldview. But Dominic surprised her. "If you could change one thing about my life," he asked over pasta and wine, "what would it be?" Elena set down her fork, studying him. "Is this a trick question?" "No, I'm asking seriously. What would you change?" She took a long breath, choosing words carefully. "I'd make you understand that power without purpose is just destruction. You've spent my whole life building an empire. But for what? Money you can't spend? Respect bought with fear? Dad, you're one of the most powerful men in Chicago, and you're completely alone. That's not success. That's tragedy." Her words hit like punches. Dominic had spent decades convincing himself that power was the goal, that strength equaled success. But sitting across from his daughter, seeing the sadness in her eyes, he realized she was right. He'd won everything, and lost what mattered. "What if I told you someone's threatening us?" Dominic said quietly. "Someone wants to take everything I've built, and the only way to stop him is more violence, more blood." Elena's face went pale. "Is this real? Are we in danger?" "Maybe. Probably. I don't know yet." "Then walk away," she said immediately. "If this life puts us in danger, walk away from it. We'll leave Chicago. Start over somewhere else. You have enough money to disappear." "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Her voice rose, drawing looks from nearby tables. She lowered it, leaning forward intensely. "It's exactly that simple, Dad. You choose. Every day you choose this life, but you could choose differently. You could choose us. You could choose peace." Dominic wanted to explain how deeply he was embedded, how many threads connected him to this world, how walking away would make him a target for everyone he'd ever wronged. But looking at Elena's desperate hope, he couldn't find the words. Maybe she was right. Maybe it really was a choice, and he'd just been too afraid or too proud to make it. The rain followed him home that night, as it seemed to follow him everywhere now. Dominic stood at his penthouse window, watching Chicago glitter and pulse beneath him. Somewhere out there, Tony Ricci was celebrating, convinced he'd won. Somewhere out there, Frank Delaney was rebuilding his life with $500 and hope. And somewhere between those two extremes, Dominic Salvatore stood at the edge of a decision that would define whatever years he had left. He could fight, defend his empire, drown the streets in blood to maintain power. Or he could walk away, choose his daughter over his kingdom, become the man Elena believed he could be. The rain drummed against the glass, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply bearing witness as a man who'd spent 30 years being invincible finally allowed himself to feel vulnerable and human and terrified of making the wrong choice. The 48 hours passed in a blur of sleepless nights and impossible calculations. Dominic consulted with Marcus, reviewed resources, mapped out scenarios. On paper, they could win a war with Ricci. They had more soldiers, better connections, deeper pockets. But wars were unpredictable, and the cost would be catastrophic regardless of victory. He kept thinking about what Elena had said. "You choose this life." The words echoed like an accusation and an invitation simultaneously. On Thursday night, 36 hours into his deadline, Dominic returned to the Adam Street shelter. He didn't tell anyone he was coming, not even Elena. He just needed to see it again, to remember why he'd stopped in the rain that night for Frank Delaney. The shelter was quiet, winding down for the evening. A few residents sat in the common area watching television. Others prepared for lights out, arranging thin mattresses into temporary homes. Frank was in the corner, playing chess with Carlos, the veteran. When he saw Dominic, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Mr. Salvatore, you came back." "Carlos, this is the man I told you about." Carlos stood, extending a hand. He was mid-40s, Hispanic, with eyes that had seen too much. "Frank says you're a guardian angel. I told him angels don't wear suits that nice." Dominic shook his hand. "I'm no angel. Just someone who made a choice. How are you doing, Frank?" "Good. Real good. My caseworker found Sarah, my daughter. She's in Milwaukee, married, got a little boy. She agreed to meet me next month." "Next month, Dominic. I'm going to see my grandson." Tears streamed down the old man's weathered face. Because of you. Because you stopped. The gratitude was overwhelming, uncomfortable. Dominic had spent 30 years being feared. Being loved, or something close to it, was unfamiliar territory. That's great, Frank. I'm happy for you. You don't look happy, Carlos observed with the directness of someone who'd faced death and stopped caring about social niceties. You look like a man carrying a world of trouble. Dominic almost laughed. You could say that. Want to talk about it? Why not? Dominic thought. These men don't know who I am. They can't judge what they don't know. So he sat down on a donated sofa that had probably been ugly even when it was new, and he talked. He didn't give details, didn't name names, but he sketched the broad strokes. A man threatening his family, a choice between violence and walking away, a life built on power that suddenly felt hollow. Frank and Carlos listened without interruption. When Dominic finished, silence filled the space between them. Then Carlos spoke, his voice rough with memory. I killed 17 people in Afghanistan, he said. 17 that I know about, probably more. Did it for my country, for my brothers in arms, because I was good at it. Came home expecting to feel like a hero. Instead, I felt like a monster. Every person I killed had a family, a story, a life, and I ended it. For what? For land, for politics, for orders from people who never got their hands dirty. He looked at Dominic with those haunted eyes. You're asking the wrong question. It's not should you walk away. It's can you live with yourself if you don't. Frank nodded agreement. I lost 8 years to the streets, Dominic. 8 years I can't get back. And why? Because I made choices that seemed right at the time. Drinking to forget, using to numb the pain, pushing away everyone who loved me. Seemed easier than facing my demons. But easy and right aren't the same thing. You gave me a second chance. Maybe it's time you gave yourself one too. Their words settled into Dominic like stones into water, creating ripples that spread wider than they should. These men, these broken, forgotten, cast-aside men, understood something fundamental that he'd spent decades ignoring. Redemption wasn't about power or money or winning. It was about choosing differently, even when it cost everything. He left the shelter near midnight, his mind clearer than it had been in days. The rain had stopped, leaving Chicago washed and gleaming under streetlights. Dominic drove aimlessly, watching the city roll past, remembering the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. Somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that strength meant never backing down, never showing weakness, never letting anyone see him bleed. But maybe real strength was the opposite. Maybe real strength was admitting when you were wrong and choosing change even when it terrified you. His phone buzzed. Marcus, we got a problem. Ricci's people grabbed Elena. The world stopped. Everything. Philosophy, doubt, redemption, evaporated in an instant, replaced by pure, primal terror. What? 20 minutes ago. She was leaving the library. 2 guys, professional, clean. They left a message. Your answer is due in 12 hours. If we don't hear from you, they start sending pieces. Dominic's vision tunneled. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. Where are you? Your place. I've mobilized everyone. Say the word. We go to war. I'm 10 minutes out. Don't move until I get there. He drove through Chicago like a demon, breaking every traffic law, his mind consumed with images of Elena hurt, scared, calling for him. This was his worst nightmare realized. His life infecting hers, his choices becoming her consequences. Tony Ricci had made the most catastrophic miscalculation of his short career. He'd threatened the one thing in this world that Dominic Salvatore would burn cities for. The monster Dominic had tried to bury was roaring back to the surface, hungry and murderous. The penthouse was a war room. 15 of his most trusted soldiers filled the space, checking weapons, reviewing maps, radiating controlled violence. Marcus met him at the door, his face grim. We found their location. Warehouse in Bridgeport, near the old rail yards. Ricci's there with maybe a dozen guys. We can hit them hard, get Elena out. How sure are you about the location? 90%. I've got eyes on the building. Saw them take her in. Dominic walked to the window, his usual thinking spot, but the city offered no answers tonight. Only darkness and glittering lights, and somewhere in that sprawl, his daughter held hostage by a man who'd mistaken mercy for weakness. Every instinct screamed for blood, to gather his army and paint Bridgeport red, to make Tony Ricci regret ever hearing the name Salvatore. But then Carlos's voice echoed in his mind. Can you live with yourself if you don't walk away? And Elena's voice. You choose this life. Every day, you choose it. Dominic turned to Marcus and his assembled soldiers, men who'd followed him for years, who trusted his judgment, who were prepared to kill and die on his word. They waited, weapons ready, eager for the violence they understood. Stand down, Dominic said quietly. The room erupted in confusion. Marcus stepped forward, his voice urgent. Dom, they have Elena. We have to move now. I said stand down. Everyone except Marcus, leave. Now. The soldiers exchanged looks but obeyed, filing out slowly until only Marcus remained. His oldest friend, his right hand, his brother in everything but blood. They stared at each other across years of shared history, and blood and choices that couldn't be undone. I'm not going to war with Ricci, Dominic said. Not the way he expects. Then how? We can't just leave Elena with those animals. I'm going to give him what he wants. My empire. My territory. Everything. In exchange for Elena. Safe and untouched. Marcus looked like he'd been punched. You'd give him everything? Just surrender? Dom, you've spent 30 years building this. You'd throw it all away? To save my daughter? Yes. Without hesitation. Dominic felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates settling into a new configuration. You were right, Marcus. You said remembering was dangerous, but maybe forgetting is worse. I forgot who I was before all this. I forgot what matters. But that night in the rain, when I saw Frank, it all came back. My mother. That scared kid asking for help that never came. I can't be that person who walks past anymore. Even if it costs me everything. Marcus's eyes glistened. They'll kill you. Ricci or someone else. The moment you give up power, you're dead. You know that. Maybe. Or maybe I'll finally get to live. Really live. Not just survive. Dominic pulled out his phone. Set up a meeting with Ricci. 1 hour. Same warehouse. Tell him I'm ready to deal. Dom, that's my final word, Marcus. Are you with me? The question hung between them, loaded with implications and consequences. Marcus could refuse, could take the soldiers and rescue Elena by force, could seize power himself, but he didn't. Because loyalty wasn't just about following orders. It was about trusting someone even when they made choices you didn't understand. Always, Marcus said quietly, until the end. They drove to Bridgeport through streets that had once been Dominic's childhood stomping grounds. The old rail yards were rusting monuments to Chicago's industrial past, filled with ghosts and memories. The warehouse where Ricci waited was lit from within, casting long shadows through broken windows. Dominic went in alone, unarmed, against every tactical instinct. He pushed open the metal door and stepped into his future, whatever that might be. Tony Ricci sat on a crate in the center of the warehouse, flanked by armed men. Behind him, tied to a chair but visibly unharmed, was Elena. Her eyes widened when she saw her father, relief and terror fighting for dominance on her face. Dominic, Ricci said, standing with a smile. 12 hours early. Eager to discuss terms? Dominic walked forward slowly, his eyes locked on Elena, sending her a silent message. I'm here. You're safe. Let her go. Then we talk. Talk first. Then maybe she goes home. No. Dominic stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see every detail of Ricci's smug expression. You wanted my empire? You have it. All territory, all operations, all connections. I'm out. Finished. But first, Elena walks free. Ricci's smile faded. Just like that? You're surrendering? I'm choosing. There's a difference. Dominic looked at his daughter, letting her see the truth in his eyes. I'm choosing her over everything else. Over power, money, respect, legacy. Over 30 years of building. Because she was right. All of this. He gestured at the warehouse. At Ricci. At the empire he was abandoning. It's meaningless if I lose what actually matters. Elena's tears came then, streaming freely down her face. Ricci looked confused, cheated somehow of the violent confrontation he'd anticipated. You're serious. You'd really walk away. Untie her, and you'll never see me again. You'll have everything you wanted, but hurt her, and I promise you, there's no amount of power or soldiers that will save you from what I'll do. That's not a threat. That's a fact. The warehouse filled with tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Ricci's men watched their boss, waiting for orders. Marcus and Dominic's soldiers waited outside, ready to storm in at the first gunshot. And in that moment, balanced on a knife's edge between violence and mercy, Tony Ricci made a choice of his own. Let her go, he told his men. They cut Elena's bonds. She stumbled forward into her father's arms, sobbing against his chest. Dominic held her like she was the most precious thing in any world, because she was. The empire he'd built, the power he'd wielded, none of it compared to the weight of his daughter in his arms, alive and safe. We're done here, Dominic told Ricci. Chicago's yours. Make better choices than I did. They walked out together, father and daughter, leaving behind everything Dominic Salvatore had been for 30 years. The rain had started again, gentle this time, almost like a blessing. As they drove away from Bridgeport, away from that life, Elena spoke. What will we do now? Dominic looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing the strength and goodness and hope that had survived despite having him as a father. We'll figure it out, together. Maybe I'll help you with that social work program. Maybe I'll finally learn what it means to be useful instead of powerful. Dad, she said, squeezing his hand. You just became the most powerful person I know, because you chose love over fear. That takes more strength than anything you've ever done. And Dominic Salvatore, former king of Chicago's underworld, broke down and cried for the first time in 30 years. The rain fell around them, washing away the old life and preparing ground for something new. The cost had been everything, but the reward, his daughter's love, his own soul, was worth infinitely more. Somewhere behind them, an empire changed hands. Somewhere ahead, a future waited, uncertain and terrifying and full of possibility. And in this moment, driving through rain-soaked Chicago streets with his daughter beside him, Dominic finally understood what Frank Delaney had felt when offered unexpected mercy. That sometimes the smallest choices, stopping in the rain, offering help, choosing love, create ripples that transform everything. The transition happened faster than Dominic expected. Within a week, Tony Ricci controlled every operation, every territory, every connection Dominic had spent 3 decades building. Marcus handled the logistics, transferring accounts, briefing key players, ensuring Dominic's soldiers understood the new power structure. Some of them were angry, feeling betrayed by what they saw as surrender. Others understood, or at least accepted Dominic's choice. Marcus himself seemed lighter somehow, as if he'd been waiting years for permission to step away from the violence. What will you do? Dominic asked him over coffee at a diner on the north side, far from their usual world. Marcus stirred cream into his cup, watching the liquid swirl. Thought I'd try something radical. Maybe go legit. I've got a sister in Arizona I haven't seen in 15 years. She runs a construction company. Says she could use someone who knows how to manage people and solve problems. Arizona, Dominic repeated, trying to imagine his right-hand man under desert sun instead of Chicago rain. That's about as far from this life as you can get. That's the idea. Marcus looked up, and his eyes were clear, unburdened. I've been following you since we were teenagers, Dom. Not because I loved the violence or the power, because I loved you, like a brother. But maybe we both needed permission to stop. You gave that to me, to both of us. They parted ways outside the diner, embracing in a way they never had during their criminal years. Honestly, without the armor of their positions between them. Marcus headed toward a new life, and Dominic returned to the penthouse one last time to pack. The place looked different now, stripped of the weight of empire, just furniture and windows and space. Elena helped him box up essentials, leaving behind the expensive suits and designer trappings of Dominic Salvatore, crime boss. She'd convinced him to keep the penthouse. It was paid for, and selling it would draw attention they didn't need. But they were moving to a smaller place in Lincoln Park, near Northwestern's campus, close to her program and far from his old haunts. What about money? Elena asked practically as they worked. I know you said you gave everything to Ricci, but I didn't give him everything, Dominic admitted. I kept enough in offshore accounts to live comfortably. Not extravagantly, but we won't starve. And I've been thinking, Frank mentioned the shelter needs funding. Maybe that's a better use for it than another sports car I don't need. Elena smiled, and it transformed her entire face. Look at you, becoming a philanthropist. I'm becoming unemployed, he corrected. But yeah, maybe giving back makes sense. I took from this city for 30 years. Time I returned something. They moved on a rainy Monday, the weather seemingly determined to mark every major transition in Dominic's life with water. The new place was a 2-bedroom condo on a quiet street lined with trees. It had tall windows, hardwood floors, and absolutely no connection to his past. Standing in the empty living room, Dominic felt simultaneously terrified and liberated. For the first time since he was 7 years old, he had no plan, no territory to protect, no empire to maintain, just space and time, and the opportunity to figure out who he was without the violence. Elena started her graduate program, diving into coursework and field placements with infectious enthusiasm. She'd come home late, full of stories about the people she was helping, the systems she was learning to navigate, the difference she was making. Dominic listened to these stories with something close to envy. His daughter had purpose, direction, a way to contribute that built instead of destroyed. What did he have? The answer came from an unexpected source. 6 weeks after leaving his empire, Dominic returned to the Adams Street shelter. Frank Delaney spotted him immediately and practically ran over, his face alight. "Dominic, I heard what you did. Gave it all up to save your daughter. That's all over the streets, man. You're a legend." Dominic winced. "That's not a good thing. Legends in my old world don't tend to last long. Different kind of legend now. You showed people that there's more to life than power. That's dangerous to some, but inspiring to others." Frank lowered his voice. "I also heard you've got time on your hands. The shelter could use someone with your skills. My skills involve violence and intimidation. Not sure how that helps. Not those skills. Your other ones. Organization, leadership, getting things done. The director here, Maria Alvarez. She's drowning in bureaucracy and funding issues. Place needs someone who knows how to navigate systems and make people listen. You telling me a guy who ran Chicago's underworld for 30 years can't handle city council and grant applications?" It was an intriguing thought. Dominic met with Maria Alvarez the next day. She was 50-something, Puerto Rican, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen every variety of human suffering and still managed to carry hope. She looked at Dominic with no illusions. "Frank told me who you are," she said bluntly over coffee in her cramped office. "Or who you were, Dominic Salvatore. The name alone used to scare people. So why would a former crime boss want to help run a homeless shelter?" Dominic appreciated the directness. "Because I'm trying to become someone different, someone useful, and because my daughter's studying social work, and I'd like to understand her world." "That's honest. I respect that." Maria pulled out a thick folder stuffed with papers. "Here's the truth. This shelter runs on nothing. We're underfunded, understaffed, drowning in regulations, and fighting the city for every dollar. We help maybe 50 people a night, but there are thousands more we turn away. I need someone who can fight bureaucracy, navigate politics, and shake money loose from places that don't want to give it. Can you do that?" Dominic looked at the folder, then at Maria's determined face, then thought about Frank and Carlos, and all the others like them. "Yes, I can do that." He started the next week, officially as a volunteer coordinator, but functionally as Maria's right hand. The work was harder than he'd expected. Navigating city regulations made mob negotiations look simple, but also more rewarding. He reached out to old connections, not for violence but for donations. A construction company owner who owed him favors donated materials to renovate the shelter's bathrooms. A restaurant chain committed to providing daily meal supplies. A law firm offered pro bono services for residents fighting evictions or legal issues. "You're really good at this," Maria observed 3 months in, reviewing a grant application Dominic had put together. "You should have been a non-profit director instead of a criminal," Dominic supplied. "Yeah, maybe, but I don't know if I'd appreciate this if I hadn't lived the other life first. Perspective matters." The shelter expanded its capacity, then its services. Dominic worked alongside Elena sometimes, watching his daughter interact with residents with effortless compassion. She was a natural, able to meet people where they were without judgment. He envied that quality, while also recognizing it as Maria's legacy. His late wife had been the same way, seeing the good in everyone, including a young enforcer named Dominic, who'd been far more monster than man back then. 7 months after leaving his empire, Dominic was at the shelter late on a Friday night, finishing paperwork, when the door burst open. 3 men entered, their intentions clear in their body language. This was a robbery. The overnight staff froze, residents scattered, and Dominic felt the old instincts rise, the combat readiness, the violence always lurking beneath his new civilian surface. The lead robber, a kid probably no older than 20, pulled a gun and aimed it at Maria. "Money. Now. Whatever you got in the safe." Dominic stood slowly, placing himself between the gun and Maria. "There's no money here, son. This is a homeless shelter. You're wasting your time. Don't sun me, old man. We know you got donations. Cash donations. Empty the safe or I start shooting. Time seemed to slow. Dominic saw several potential futures branching out. In one, he disarmed this kid, hurt him badly, maybe killed him, ended the threat through violence. The old Dominic would have done exactly that without hesitation. But in another future, he did something different. "What's your name?" Dominic asked. The question clearly threw the kid. "What? Your name? If you're going to rob us, I figure I should know who you are." "Shut up. Just shut up and open the safe." "I will. But first, tell me your name." Dominic's voice was calm, almost gentle. "And tell me why you need money badly enough to rob a place that helps people like you." The kid's hand shook. His two companions looked nervous, uncertain. This wasn't going according to whatever plan they'd had. "DeAndre," he finally said. "My name's DeAndre Johnson, and I need money because my sister needs medicine we can't afford, and I've tried everything else, so just give me the damn money." Dominic recognized the desperation. He'd worn it himself once, standing in the rain with his mother, invisible to a city that didn't care. "How old's your sister?" 9. "She's got diabetes. We can't afford her insulin. So either give me the money or shoot me, man, because I'm not leaving without something." "Okay, DeAndre. I believe you. But here's the thing. There's maybe $300 in that safe. That'll buy you what? A week's worth of insulin? Maybe 2 if you're lucky. Then what? Rob another shelter?" The gun wavered. "I don't know, man. I don't know." "Lower the gun," Dominic said quietly. "Lower it, and let me help you. For real. Not a robbery, not a quick fix. Actual help. Why would you help me? I just tried to rob you. Because 7 months ago, someone gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. And it changed everything. So lower the gun, DeAndre. Let me pay it forward." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, DeAndre lowered the weapon. His companions bolted for the door, abandoning him. But DeAndre stayed. He collapsed onto a chair, the gun clattering to the floor, and started crying. He was just a kid, terrified and out of options, trying desperately to save his sister the only way he knew how. Maria called the police but asked them not to press charges given the circumstances. Dominic called Elena, who called contacts in the social work network. By morning, they'd connected DeAndre's family to emergency medical assistance programs, found resources for ongoing insulin supplies, and enrolled DeAndre himself in a job training program. The kid left the shelter exhausted and stunned, his sister's life no longer balanced on a knife's edge. "You could have hurt him," Maria said after everyone had left, and the shelter returned to normal. "The old you would have. I saw it in your eyes. You knew exactly how to disarm him, probably permanently." "Yeah," Dominic admitted, "but that wouldn't have solved anything. He'd be in the hospital or worse. His sister would still need insulin, and the cycle would continue. This way, maybe we actually fix something instead of just ending a threat." "That's the difference between power and purpose," Maria said. "Power just maintains the status quo through fear. Purpose actually changes things. You're learning." That night, alone in his condo, Dominic stood at the window watching rain fall on Lincoln Park. He thought about DeAndre, about Frank, about Carlos and Sandra, and all the others whose lives he'd touched since stopping that night on State Street. One small choice, giving a homeless man $500, had cascaded into this completely different existence. He'd lost an empire, but found something more valuable: redemption, purpose, the ability to look at himself in the mirror without flinching. The rain drummed its eternal rhythm, and Dominic Salvatore, no longer a crime boss, just a man trying to make amends, felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. Peace. Not the peace of dominance or the absence of threat. The peace of knowing that what he was building now was something that might actually last, because it was built on helping instead of hurting. The foundation had been laid. Now came the harder work of constructing a life that mattered, brick by brick, choice by choice, until the old life was nothing but a story used to illuminate how far someone could fall and still find their way back to light. 14 months after Dominic walked away from his empire, Chicago experienced one of its coldest winters in decades. The rain he'd become so familiar with transformed into snow and ice, blanketing the city in white that looked pure, until cars and salt turned it gray and brown. But inside the Adams Street shelter, warmth radiated from more than just the heating system. The place had been transformed: renovated bathrooms, expanded sleeping quarters, A new kitchen capable of serving hot meals to 80 people nightly instead of 50, and a dedicated counseling center where residents could work with social workers, job trainers, and addiction specialists. Dominic had orchestrated much of this transformation, leveraging connections and funds in ways that were technically legal, but carried echoes of his old efficiency. The difference was the goal. Instead of building an empire for himself, he was building infrastructure for people society had abandoned. Maria often joked that he'd gone from crime boss to nonprofit boss, trading one kind of power for another. But Dominic knew it was different. This power didn't fear him. It thanked him. Elena had graduated with her master's in social work and taken a position at the shelter, working alongside her father. Their relationship had transformed completely, no longer distant and tense, but collaborative and warm. They shared dinners several nights a week, discussing cases and strategies, approaching Chicago's homeless crisis like a puzzle that could be solved with enough care and resources. Watching his daughter work, seeing her compassion and skill, Dominic felt something he'd rarely experienced. Pride that wasn't tainted with guilt or blood. Frank Delaney had moved to Milwaukee to live near his daughters Sarah and grandson Jacob, but he called Dominic monthly, and they'd become unlikely friends. Two men from opposite ends of life's spectrum who'd found common ground in second chances. Frank's last call had been full of joy. He'd gotten a part-time job at a community center, helping other people in recovery. "You started a chain reaction," Frank had told him. "You saved me, and now I'm saving others. That's how grace works, Dom. It multiplies." On a Thursday evening in late February, Dominic was closing the shelter office when Maria poked her head in. "Got someone here asking for you. Says it's important." Dominic tensed instinctively. Old habits died hard. He'd been waiting for 14 months for someone from his past to come calling, either for revenge or to drag him back into that world. He followed Maria to the common area, mentally cataloging exits and potential weapons, his body remembering violence even if his mind had moved beyond it. But the person waiting wasn't a gangster or an enforcer. It was DeAndre Johnson, the kid who'd tried to rob the shelter. He'd grown in the past year, taller, broader, carrying himself with new confidence. He stood when Dominic entered, nervous but determined. "Mr. Salvatore, sorry to just show up, but I wanted to tell you something in person." Dominic shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses of someone who worked with their hands. "DeAndre, good to see you. How's your sister?" "She's great, healthy. The assistance programs you hooked us up with, they saved her life, but that's not why I'm here." DeAndre took a breath. "I finished the job training program, got certified as an electrician, found a good company that hired me despite my record. I've been working for 6 months, saving money, and I wanted to do this." He pulled out an envelope and handed it to Dominic. Inside was $300 in cash, the exact amount that had been in the shelter's safe the night DeAndre tried to rob it. "I can't take this," Dominic said immediately. "You didn't actually steal anything. You don't owe." "Yes, I do," DeAndre interrupted firmly. "Not because of what I took. You're right. I didn't get anything. But because of what you gave me. You could have had me arrested, beaten, killed even. Instead, you helped. You changed the trajectory of my entire life. So this money, it's not repayment for a debt. It's a promise. A promise that I'll do the same for someone else when I get the chance. Pay it forward, like you said." Dominic felt his throat tighten. He looked at the cash, then at this young man who'd been desperate enough to threaten violence, and was now standing here with dignity and purpose. "Your sister's medical bills are covered. You're stable. We're good. Really good. Better than we've been in years. Then I'll take this money on one condition. I use it to help the next person who comes through that door as desperate as you were. Deal?" DeAndre smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Deal." After DeAndre left, Dominic stood in the shelter's entryway, holding the envelope and watching snow fall through the windows. Maria joined him, her presence comfortable and knowing. "You've done something remarkable here," she said. "Changed lives. Built something lasting. I hope you're proud." "I'm grateful," Dominic corrected. "Pride feels like I accomplished this alone, but it took a homeless man asking for $1, my daughter believing I could be better, you giving me a chance, and 100 other moments I didn't plan or control. I'm just grateful I was smart enough to listen when life offered me an exit ramp." "Smart and brave," Maria amended. "Walking away from power is rare. Most people hold on until it destroys them. You let go and found something better." That night, Dominic met Elena for dinner at a small Italian place in Little Italy. Not Rossi's, his old negotiation spot, but a family restaurant where nobody knew his name or history. Over pasta and wine, he told her about DeAndre's visit. Elena listened with that focused attention she'd inherited from her mother, her eyes shining with emotion. That's beautiful, Dad. That's the kind of legacy that matters. Not territory or fear, but lives changed, chains broken. I've been thinking, Dominic said, setting down his fork, about your mother, about how ashamed she'd be of the 30 years after she died. But maybe, wherever she is, she's watching now. Maybe she'd be proud of the last 14 months. I'd like to think so. Elena reached across the table and took his hand. Mom knew who you were underneath all the armor. She told me once, when I was little, that your heart was bigger than you'd ever admit, that you'd built walls to survive, but the heart was still there, waiting. She'd be proud, Dad. I know she would. And I'm proud too. They finished dinner talking about the future. Elena wanted to expand the shelter's services to include a youth program, preventing kids like DeAndre from ever reaching that breaking point. Dominic mentioned he'd been talking to other shelter directors about creating a network, sharing resources and strategies across Chicago. They dreamed together, father and daughter, building plans on a foundation of hope instead of fear. Walking back to his condo later, Dominic detoured past State Street, the place where this all began. The doorway where he'd found Frank Delaney was empty now, just another piece of architecture in an indifferent city. But Dominic stood there for a moment, remembering the rain and the old man's question, and the choice that had changed everything. $1 requested, 500 given, an empire abandoned, a life reclaimed. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Mr. Salvatore, this is Carlos from the shelter. I got a job interview tomorrow. First one in 3 years. Wanted to thank you for helping with my resume. Wish me luck. Dominic smiled and typed back. You don't need luck. You've got everything you need. But good luck anyway. Let me know how it goes. More texts followed. A thank you from Sandra, who'd gotten into subsidized housing with her kids. An update from the shelter's new volunteer coordinator about record donation numbers. A photo from Frank of his grandson Jacob, captioned, 3 generations together at last. Each message was a thread in a larger tapestry, a web of changed lives spreading out from that one night in the rain. Dominic continued walking, snow crunching under his expensive shoes, the one luxury he'd kept, because good shoes mattered when you spent all day on your feet helping people. He thought about Tony Ricci, who'd taken over his empire and was reportedly struggling to maintain control. Territory wars were brewing. Violence was escalating. The cycle Dominic had perpetuated for 30 years continued without him, proof that the system was bigger than any one person and that walking away had been right. He thought about Marcus, who sent postcards from Arizona showing desert sunsets and construction sites. His last message had said simply, "Found peace. Hope you have too." And he thought about himself, Dominic Salvatore, age 49, former crime lord, current volunteer, perpetual work in progress. He wasn't deluded enough to think he'd erased 30 years of damage. People had died because of his orders. Families had been destroyed by his business. That blood didn't wash away, no matter how many good deeds followed. But maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about making the future different. About breaking cycles instead of perpetuating them. About choosing compassion over power, even when it cost everything. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing Chicago in fresh white, covering the old and making space for the new. Dominic turned toward home, toward his small condo, where no empire waited, but where his daughter might call to say goodnight. Toward his life, this imperfect, humble, meaningful life he'd built from the ashes of his old existence. He wasn't a king anymore. He wasn't feared or powerful or rich by his old standards, but he was useful. He was present. He was, perhaps for the first time in 30 years, truly alive. The final image that would stay with him came the next morning. Dominic arrived at the shelter early and found a young man sitting on the front steps, shivering in inadequate clothing against the cold. The man looked up as Dominic approached, his eyes empty with desperation. "Sorry, man. I know you're not open yet. I don't have anywhere else to go." Dominic saw himself in that face, saw Frank Delaney, saw DeAndre and Carlos and Sandra and every person who'd ever been pushed to the edge of society and told they didn't matter. He pulled out his keys and unlocked the door. "Come inside. Get warm. We'll figure this out together." The man followed him in, disbelief morphing into cautious hope. And Dominic Salvatore, who'd spent 30 years taking from this city, continued the work of giving back. One person at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of mercy multiplying into another, rippling outward like rain hitting water, spreading farther than he could see or control or claim credit for. The empire was gone. The legend was fading, but the work remained, and the man doing it was finally someone he could look at in the mirror without flinching. The rain, now snow, continued to fall, washing the city clean, and Dominic stood in that sheltered doorway watching a new day break over Chicago. No longer a king of shadows, but a servant of light, and it was enough. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. This channel brings you powerful stories of transformation and redemption every week. Subscribe so you never miss a story, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever made a choice that changed your life completely? What would you sacrifice for the people you love? Your stories matter, and I'd love to hear them. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to choose differently.